A stray howl cracked through the pine woods like a whip just as Ben Coleridge slammed the cabin door shut and dropped the trap sack onto the floorboards. Snow blew in after him, stinging the back of his neck, and for a moment he just stood there, shaking from cold and something deeper. Not fear, not yet, but close. The fire was down to a dull orange bruise in the hearth, and when he knelt to stir the embers with the poker, they barely flinched. That was the third day in a row he'd come back from the line with hands raw and nose half frozen, only to find the place on the verge of frost. He'd already burned half his log stack by early December, and the sky outside was black with another storm. No more time, no more guessing. He had to do it now. Ben straightened up slowly, turned and stared at the space under the cot. For weeks he'd put it off, reasoning with himself that it was foolish, that he'd been warm last winter just fine, even in the freeze of late January. But that wasn't true. He remembered shivering until his muscles cramped. He remembered coughing up blood from cold lungs and waking with frost rimming the inside of his cabin wall. That was a lie he'd told himself so he wouldn't have to admit what he'd figured out. The problem wasn't the walls. It wasn't the windows, it was beneath him. The cold seeped through the ground. He dropped to his knees and pulled aside the old wool blanket he'd pinned there to stop drafts. The dirt beneath had already been disturbed. He'd started digging a week ago, after the first frost sunk into his boots while he slept. But then he'd stopped, too unnerved by the shape the idea was taking. Not tonight. He reached for the small spade near the door and returned to the crawl space under the cot. It wasn't spacious, just a little hollow where the bed stood. The wood floor didn't go all the way beneath. It was built short to save lumber. Most cabins out here were built like that. Floors where the boots went, dirt where you didn't look. Ben stabbed the blade into the soil and began carving the hole deeper. He didn't know how long he worked. Time bent when you did something half crazy. He only knew that when he stopped, the wind outside had gone quiet, and his back was soaked with sweat. The hole now stretched about 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep, a neat black pit directly beneath his sleeping cot. And then, without hesitation, he stood up, grabbed the old iron stovepipe elbow he'd found out behind the shed 3 years ago, and lowered it into the hole. One end flanged, the other open. The metal hissed when it touched the snow-cold dirt. He packed soil around its base to wedge it upright and stable. He wasn't building a stove, he was building a chimney. That was the part no one would believe, if there were anyone to tell, that a man could make a chimney underground, not to let smoke out, but to draw warm air up. A reverse draw, a thing he'd read about once in a crumbling book some trapper had passed along, half mad and sunblind. The trick was to create a passive current, a slow, natural movement of air, like how caves held warmth even in winter. If you heated the earth just enough, the air would rise. If you trapped that warmth beneath the right spot, say a cot, say your bones, it would follow you. Ben stepped back and stared at the pipe. It looked absurd, like something a child would make. He felt the panic rise again. This was all too late. He'd wasted time. He should have dug a better cellar in the fall. He should have traded beaver for coal in September. He should have, but the thought stopped as he reached into the bin beside the hearth and pulled out a single log, the last of the good ones, pine cured for 2 years, dense and fat with resin. He didn't need it to burn fast. He needed it to live long. He knelt and lit the stub of a taper, then held it to the top of the log and waited. The flame kissed it gently. It caught. Ben lowered the log into the pit and set it upright beside the pipe, making sure it was deep in the center of the hole. Then he set 2 flat stones on either side to guide the heat. He had no bellows, no fan, no draft pull, just the iron pipe, the dirt, and the slow, rising breath of fire. And when he lay down that night, the wind still outside, the world black with snow, the warmth crept up beneath him like a ghost curling around his spine. He didn't sleep at first. He just lay there, hand on his chest, listening, waiting. And then he felt it. Not heat, not yet, but something not cold, a softness, a promise. By dawn, the cabin air was still cold, but his cot was warm, not just the blanket, the wood beneath him, his boots beside the bed. Even the water in his flask hadn't frozen. He blinked and sat up, confused, as if the world had cheated him out of suffering. It worked. But with the sun came questions. Would the warmth last? Would the earth hold it? And if it did, what would it take? Ben got up and opened the door to the pale grey morning. The snow was fresh, piled high on the trapline trail, but the sky was calm. It was the kind of morning that lied to you, looked gentle, felt quiet, but could freeze you stiff by noon. He looked back at the bed, then the hole beneath it, and he knew what he had to do next. The warmth wasn't free, and if he wanted it to last, he'd need to go deeper. Ben didn't tell himself it was madness anymore. That excuse had expired sometime during the second hour of that morning, when he woke warm despite the frost webbing the windows and the snow stacked like death along the outer sill. For a man to feel the edge of real warmth in a high country cabin, without a fire in the stove or coals in the hearth, was no small thing, not in December, not when you'd lived a life of counting splinters and measuring kindling by breath. The warmth hadn't just lingered, it had settled, heavy and low, like how moss clung to the riverbank stones in spring, clinging to his cot and his back, and even the old tin cup he left by the nightstand. He'd stared at that tin cup for a full minute before daring to touch it. It wasn't ice, just cool, not the biting sting of freeze, but the kind of chill that hinted something in the room had changed without asking permission. He leaned down, blanket in hand, and pulled it aside to study the hole again. The pipe glowed faintly, soft orange in the deepest part where the logs still flickered. Smoke wasn't rising, there was none. Just slow curls of heat, invisible but alive, moving up the shaft. The dirt walls were blackened slightly, like soot had been coaxed into them. The fire below had not consumed the log quickly. It had merely kissed it, then whispered, then slept beside it. That was the part that troubled him most. A fire that didn't burn like a fire, a warmth that didn't move like heat. Ben didn't trust it, but he couldn't ignore it either. He spent the first hours of daylight packing his traps and heading down toward Elk Hollow, mostly out of duty. His hands moved by habit, checking lures and lines, but his thoughts weren't on the trail. They were back under the cot, back in that hole. He wasn't chasing furs, not truly. The silver fox he'd been tracking for weeks had likely moved on anyway. He was only walking because he couldn't sit still. The weight of the warmth had settled into him like guilt. By midday, the wind picked up again. The soft drift of morning hardened into a bitter gust from the northwest, and the sky threatened ash-gray. Ben turned back early, pulling his scarf higher over his cracked lips, and by the time he returned to the cabin, snow was already drifting against the walls again. But when he opened the door, it hit him. A pocket of air, soft, rich, and strange, greeted him like a hand to the cheek. He stepped inside and shut the door hard behind him, blinking through the dim light. His cot looked unchanged, the hole beneath still open and framed by the curtain of the wool blanket he'd used to cover it. But something about the air inside the cabin had shifted. He dropped his pack, moved slowly to the bed, and knelt. The log was mostly intact. It had burned down by maybe a third, but it glowed still, embers alive in the bottom of the pit. The stovepipe no longer looked absurd. It looked necessary. Ben sat back, rubbed his beard, and whispered, "I'll be damned." But he wasn't smiling. He couldn't, because beneath the ore, there was a creeping realization. If this worked, really worked, it would change everything. He could survive the freeze without splitting another log. He could last the entire winter without risking a lung for more timber. He could stay warm without firewood, but only if it lasted, and only if he figured out how to control it. That night he didn't burn anything in the hearth. He cooked with a little scrap of lard on the iron skillet, set over a flame no bigger than a candle. He used a pinch of beans, no salt, and chewed in silence. He kept the cot in sight the entire time. The hole below breathed a steady hush of warmth, so faint it might have been imagined, if not for the way it kept frost from creeping up the cabin walls. He measured the warmth not by touch, but by what stayed unfrozen. The flask, the cup, the water bowl for washing, all still fluid by sunrise. And it was sunrise that brought something else, a sound, not from outside, not from wind, but below. Ben had awoken suddenly. It wasn't light yet, but the sky was turning from black to dark navy, the first color before a storm. His eyes snapped open, breath already caught in his throat, and he held still, not from fear, but from recognition. A hollow thump, muffled, faint, then nothing. He sat up, slowly. Cold hadn't touched him all night. The hole still pulsed warm. But that sound, it had come from the earth. No, from beneath the earth. He lit the lantern with shaking hands and knelt by the cot. The fire in the hole had died down. The log was mostly ember now, no flame, but the air still rose warm. He stared into the dirt, heart pounding, then reached for the poker. He tapped the edges of the pit, gently, listening. Nothing moved, no echo, no loose stones, no shifting gravel. Then he did something he hadn't dared before. He reached down and pressed his hand flat against the dirt beside the embers. Warm, and then vibration, just the faintest hum, like breath beneath the earth. Ben yanked his hand back. For a long time he said nothing. He just sat there, watching the hole, waiting for the earth to breathe again. But it didn't, not that night, nor the next. What it did do was stay warm. That was the problem, because by the end of the fourth night the log was dead, cold, charred to blackness. No more flame, no glow, and yet the warmth remained. Ben tried to ignore it. He told himself the earth must have stored the heat somehow, held it like a kettle. Maybe the stones, maybe the iron pipe, maybe even the clay content of the dirt below, maybe. But it was no use. The warmth continued, even with nothing burning. By the end of the week, He couldn't sleep. The snow outside grew worse. Days passed where he didn't check his traps at all. The woodpile stayed untouched, save for a few slivers he used for cooking. The hearth sat unused, but the cot stayed warm, and the hole, always the hole, kept breathing. He thought maybe he'd buried something, disturbed something, some natural vent, some fault line. But he'd lived in these hills 12 years. There were no hot springs here, no volcanic flow, no underground steam. The nearest was 40 miles west, across the divide. This was new. By the 10th day, Ben could feel the warmth before he entered the cabin, like stepping into a cave that remembered summer. By the 12th day, he knew he had to dig again, not because the warmth failed, but because it hadn't, because it should have. Something was feeding it, but it wasn't wood, and it wasn't him. Ben didn't light a lamp. He moved in silence through the pale morning light that drifted through frost-glazed windows, stepping barefoot on floorboards that should have been freezing but weren't. He didn't even stop to wrap himself in his coat or pull on his boots. Something about the air inside the cabin had changed again, not in temperature, but in weight. It had grown thicker. He crouched beside the cot, brushed aside the wool blanket he always left tucked against the frame, and stared down into the hole. The log was ash now, not just charred, dissolved, collapsed into white powder like it had never burned at all. But there was no smoke, no mess, no odor of fire. The stovepipe, too, had gone cold to the touch. And yet, when he leaned closer, the dirt walls of the hole still radiated warmth, like the body heat of something that had just risen and walked away. Ben breathed shallow. He didn't want to inhale too deeply, not because of smoke or gas or some sickness from the earth, but because he suddenly feared disturbing something that had settled there. Not physically, not a thing he could grab, but a presence. That was the word that formed in his mind. Uninvited. Presence. He wanted to tell himself this was just the ground retaining heat, that the embers had warmed the earth enough to act like a clay stove. That's what the old story said, wasn't it? The book he'd half read in his youth, a tattered field guide passed around trappers like a ghost story, spoke of Mongol shelters with buried coals that kept yurts warm for weeks. Ben had believed it once. He'd believed it again when he built the pit. But now he knew better. That heat hadn't come from a single log, and it hadn't come from any trick of soil or science. Because the warmth hadn't faded, it had grown. The cot was hot to the touch now, not just warm, hot. He'd noticed it in the night and had tossed his blankets off in his sleep, sweating through his shirt in the middle of a blizzard. He thought maybe he'd caught a fever, but when he checked his face in the cracked mirror and saw no flush, and dipped his shirt in the tin bowl and found the water steaming, he knew it wasn't sickness. It was the hole. Something was burning beneath that dirt. Something that wasn't wood. Ben sat back and ran a hand through his beard. The day outside was white, blank with snow. The kind of nothingness that swallowed your boots and your mind if you stared too long. He should have been out checking traps, breaking trails, hunting sign. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with that heat still rising. So he made a decision. He went to the cupboard, pulled out his tools, and returned to the cot. And he dug. He didn't use the old spade this time. He used a sharper trowel, a tool meant for delicate work, gardening once, though there hadn't been a garden on this land in years. He needed to cut precise, careful strokes, not just scrape away soil, but listen to it. And as he dug deeper, the sound of the dirt changed. It no longer crumbled dry, but peeled, like wet clay, thick and oily. 6 inches down, he found the edge of the pipe. 8 inches down, he found bone. He stopped, stared, looked again. It wasn't animal, that was clear at once. The curve was too smooth, too deliberate. A socket, a ridge, a human bone, long and pale and perfectly preserved. Not old and decayed, not blackened by rot or time, but clean. Clean like it had been placed there recently. Clean like it had been heated from within. Ben sat back hard against the cot, heart hammering. He hadn't buried anyone. He hadn't dug up graves. There was nothing down here, nothing but soil. This was virgin land. The map said so. The mountain trappers said so. Hell, he'd cleared the land himself. And yet, he reached forward, hand shaking, and brushed more dirt aside. The trowel clinked softly. Another bone, then another. A rib cage. Ben dropped the trowel. He couldn't breathe. For a long time, he just knelt there, listening to his own heart, the wind outside, and the silence from the hole. The warmth still rose, and now it was unmistakable, not passive, pulsing, rhythmic, breath-like. He didn't dig further. He couldn't. He backed away, stood up too fast, and knocked his head against the cot frame. The pain helped, snapped him back. He went to the corner and pulled on his coat and boots with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He had to get out, clear his head, think. He stepped outside into the blizzard. The cold slammed him like a hammer, but he didn't care. He walked, first toward the trail, then past it, then down the ridge to the half-frozen creek where he once bathed in spring. The snow was knee-deep, and his breath steamed like smoke and his coat crusted with frost in minutes. But he didn't stop. Not until he reached the grove, the place he'd buried his traps. Not his trapping traps, but his old traps. The ones he swore he'd never use again. Bare jaws, rusted steel teeth. Things meant to crush bone and keep it crushed. Illegal in the towns, tolerated in the hills. He'd sworn off them years ago after the accident with the red fox. The scream it made haunted him still. But now, he crouched by the old pine stump, brushed away snow, dug down with gloved hands, and found the cache. Oiled canvas, wrapped twice. Inside, 5 traps, all functional. He didn't know what he was preparing for, but the warmth under his bed had bones in it, and bones meant something had died, or something was still dying. That night he didn't sleep. He didn't dare. He set 3 of the traps beneath the cot, beside the hole. Not to catch, but to warn. If anything came up from the dirt, it would spring the steel jaws before it reached him. He placed the other 2 by the door and kept his hatchet close. The warmth continued. Unbothered, steady. He didn't feed it, didn't add wood, didn't touch the pit, but still, it rose. By morning, the cabin was near hot. He opened the door and let the snow in. He had to. The next day, he did something worse. He went back to the hole and dug deeper, this time not with fear, but with anger. He didn't stop after the ribcage. He scraped further, past the pelvis, down to the femurs. The bones didn't look like they'd been buried. They looked placed, arranged. The skull sat atop a smooth stone, facing upward, mouth slightly open. And beneath the skull, at the very bottom of the hole, he found the second pipe. He hadn't placed it, but there it was. Same make, same iron flange, identical to the one he'd buried himself. Only this one ran down, deeper still. He stared at it for a long time, and then, without fully knowing why, he leaned close, pressed his ear to the edge, and heard the breathing. Not wind, not echoes, breathing, slow, wet, regular, alive. Ben fell back, scrambled away, eyes wide, breath ragged. He reached for the traps, reset them, pulled the cot back from the hole entirely, and pushed it against the far wall. He could not sleep there again. He would not. But the next night, even from across the room, the warmth reached him. Not just heat, a pull. It came like a whisper in his blood, calling him back to the cot, to the pit, to the thing beneath. He did not move. He sat by the door with his axe in hand, and in the darkest hour of night, when the wind died and the snow fell silent, he heard it again. The trap snapped. 1, then 2, then silence. Ben didn't move. He just gripped the axe tighter, because he knew then the warmth was not a blessing, it was a bargain, and something beneath his cabin had accepted the first offering. Ben didn't move from the chair for nearly 2 hours. He sat in the dark, axe clenched between his knees, jaw locked tight as stone. Outside, snow fell soundlessly, a white death draping the woods, but inside, the cabin had no right to be warm, and yet it was, still, even after the trap had snapped. He hadn't gone to check, not at first. He couldn't. His body refused to move, as though something in the blood had cooled all at once, and no amount of heat in the room could stir it. Only once the sun threatened grey light through the frost-glazed window did he dare rise. His boots thudded softly on the warm wood floor. The boards shouldn't have been warm. The stove hadn't been lit in 4 days. The hearth sat unused, the log pile untouched. Only the hole remained active. Ben approached it slowly, eyes locked on the wool blanket now askew on the floor, pushed aside by something during the night. The traps were still set in their half-moon around the hole, all but one. That one, the heavy iron bear trap, now hung open, one spring sprung, jaws bent wide with something jammed between them. He crouched, stared. It wasn't bone, it wasn't wood, it was cloth. A piece of old flannel, red and black, frayed at the edge, familiar. Ben leaned in closer, breath slow, heart thudding. He recognized it. It was his own shirt, the one he'd burned last winter when the hem caught fire by accident. He'd thrown it into the hearth in a panic, watched it blacken and curl, seen the cloth disappear in flame. But here it was, torn, folded, jammed between iron teeth, still warm to the touch. He sat back on his heels, disoriented. He wasn't just confused, he was disoriented, like the world had changed shape in the night and refused to change back. He reached out and lifted the cloth free. The trap snapped shut with a clatter, making him flinch. He held the flannel to his face, smelled it, smoke, and something else. Ash mixed with meat, like a hearth where something besides wood had burned. Ben stood. He no longer felt safe in the room, that much was certain. But it wasn't the kind of fear that sent a man running. It was the kind that made him quiet, measured, listening. He packed his bag that morning, not with tools or furs, but with rope, tin, a spade, 3 candles, 2 knives, a compass, flint, rags, and the old field guide. The book had been buried in the trunk beneath his bed for years, forgotten until now. He hadn't even remembered why he kept it, just that something in it had felt unfinished, like it wasn't meant to be read in the summer. He flipped to the final pages, thumbing through brittle parchment, and found the section he'd half remembered all winter. Breath of the Earth, it was titled. Subsection of primitive heat-keeping practices. It wasn't written like the rest. It had margin notes, scribbled annotations, ink scrawled by someone in the margins like they were trying to correct the author or leave warnings for the next man. He read it aloud, voice quiet. If the hole be dug deep and lined with iron, and the warmth summoned by sacrificial ember, the breath may rise. The ground drinks the fire. But beware, not all fire leaves ash. Some leave memory. Another line below in shakier ink. It keeps you warm because it knows you. Ben closed the book. The snow outside had quieted. The sky above the pines cracked pale yellow, the kind of false dawn that lied to your face. He stepped out into it, pack slung over one shoulder, and began the slow climb up the ridge. He didn't plan to stay gone long, just enough to prove something. He had to know. If he left the hole alone, if he stepped away from it completely, would it still stay warm, or was it following him? He hiked until the cabin vanished below the tree line, until the pines swallowed the roof and the trail behind him vanished. He stopped near a bend of old shale rock where the creek had frozen solid in place, and there he made camp. No fire, no tent, just snow and sky. He waited. 3 hours passed. His fingers numbed. The chill returned to his bones like a forgotten wound. His flask froze in the pack. His breath turned thick and labored, and that's when he knew the warmth wasn't following him. It had never been about him at all. It had stayed behind, at the cabin, waiting. Ben returned by moonlight. He didn't walk. He ran, stumbled through knee-deep snow, face burning, lungs clawing for air. The chill had stripped every thought from him but one. It's still there. When he burst through the cabin door, the heat hit him like a fever. The cot was warm again. No, hot. Steam clung to the windows. The wood floor sweated. The tin cup on the table hissed when he touched it. He dropped to his knees beside the hole. No log burned. No pipe glowed. And yet the dirt pulsed warmth in slow, terrible waves. He reached down and touched it. It breathed. He recoiled, heart pounding, skin crawling. He should have run then, taken only what he needed, and gone down the pass to the next valley, walked till his legs gave or till someone found him. But he didn't. He couldn't, because in the center of the hole, where the earth dipped slightly, where the ashes should have been cold and gone, there now lay a second skull. He didn't recognize it, but it hadn't been there before. It sat in the very place the second iron pipe led down, like something had been delivered back up. He leaned in, trembling, and then he saw it. Not the shape, not the cracks, but the teeth. They were human, and one of them, a molar near the back, was gold. Ben had seen that tooth before, 5 years ago, in a man named Mallory Hayes, a trapper who vanished in these very hills, thought to be buried in a storm. Ben fell backward. The cabin swam. The heat rose higher. He couldn't breathe. He stumbled to the door, yanked it open, and snow flooded in. But even that didn't cool the air. The heat refused to leave. He grabbed the axe, turned, and brought it down on the edge of the pit. The first swing struck the rim. The second sheared into the iron pipe. The third sank deep into the skull, and the heat stopped just like that, gone, like a match snuffed in a windless room. The silence after was unbearable. He fell to the floor, breath shaking, forehead pressed to cold wood. The warmth didn't return that night, nor the next. He waited, unsure, not relieved, just empty. But on the third night, when the cold took his toes again, when the flask froze solid and his spit cracked on the floorboards, he found himself staring at the black hole beneath his cot and wondering, not if he could bring it back, but what he would have to give it. Ben didn't leave the cabin again, not to check the trapline, not to gather wood, not even to piss. The snow outside had sealed the door halfway up its height, and he hadn't the heart to shovel it clear. Instead, he stayed in the gloom, huddled in the corner like a man sitting vigil at his own wake, wrapped in a bear pelt that no longer kept the cold from his bones. His fingers cracked, his lips split. He could feel the edges of frostbite creeping through his heels like a promise whispered in reverse. And yet he stared at the hole, not with fear anymore, with hunger, not for food. He had that still in modest amounts. A handful of beans, some salt, a strip of deer jerky grown tough as bark. He ate mechanically. He drank snowmelt that he warmed over a candle stub. He moved only to live. But the hole, that was where his eyes returned. The warmth hadn't come back, not since he'd buried the axe in the skull, not since he'd broken the pipe. He could admit now, not aloud, but to himself, that he'd done it out of panic, not courage. He hadn't defeated anything. He'd only ruptured the strange pact without understanding what it required. And now that it was gone, truly gone, the memory of its comfort had become unbearable. He dreamt of it, that steady, unnatural heat crawling through the floorboards like a faithful dog, curling at his feet as the mountain tried to kill him. That soft pulse, like a heartbeat stitched into the earth beneath him. That breath, that presence. He knew it hadn't been fire, and he knew it hadn't been just bones either. Something had been feeding that warmth. That much was clear now. Some buried thing beneath the iron. Something that accepted heat the way a stomach accepted meat, and gave back something deeper, older, alive. He hadn't spoken in 4 days. Not since the last trap snapped. Not since the gold-toothed skull came up. But now, crouched on the floor before the hole, Ben found his voice, ragged, quiet. "I'm sorry." No one answered. The room creaked. The stove was cold, the cot untouched, and still silence. Ben reached down into the pit. It was black now, not just empty, but lightless, like the earth had shut its mouth. He withdrew his hand, fumbled for the lantern, lit it, then made a decision. He would go back down, but not to bury something, to offer. He opened the cupboard and began sorting. Not food, not clothing. He pulled out the items of weight, the things the world had left him that it shouldn't have. A ring from the woman he once intended to marry before she left for Fort Bridger and vanished into the plains. His father's knife, never used, still in its sheath. A strip of buckskin with the initials of a brother who hadn't returned from the war. Each he placed in a pile beside the hole. He lit the lantern fully and shined it down. Still nothing, still black. But he felt something now. A change. Not warmth, not yet, but a pull. He dropped the ring in first, waited, no sound. Then the knife, then the strip of buckskin. Still nothing. But the air, it grew thicker. He stood slowly, eyes on the pit, heart thudding, then crossed the room and picked up the old iron pipe, the broken one, the one he'd ruptured. He set it on the edge of the hole, reconnected the flange, and slid it back into the earth, packed the dirt tight around it, made the connection whole again. The cabin was utterly silent. Even the wind outside had paused. Ben stood above the hole and whispered, "I understand now." He didn't know if he believed it, but he said it, and then he reached to the hearth, where the very last piece of pine, one resinous golden log, still waited. He hadn't touched it in weeks, had refused to burn it even in the worst of cold. He brought it to the hole, lit a taper, held it to the edge. The log caught, not in flame but in glow, a faint red ember at its center. He lowered it into the pit and sat back, watching, waiting. It took time, longer than before. Minutes stretched. The log blackened. The pipe steamed. Then a sound from below, soft, wet, like lips parting underwater. Then warmth, a faint breath, a pulse. Ben exhaled. The trap beneath the cot snapped again, loud in the silence. But he didn't jump this time. He didn't flinch. He only nodded. It had returned. The presence, the breath, the warmth. And this time, he welcomed it. That night, the cabin was warmer than it had ever been. Not hot, comfortable, natural. Ben lay on the cot, eyes open, breath slow. He knew better now than to ask questions. The presence beneath him didn't care for words. It cared for exchange. And he understood now that the log had never been enough. It had simply been a key. What came next? What stayed? That came from him, his grief, his surrender, his willingness to give what he had left in the world. Names, memories, the ring, the knife, the brother's mark, and offer them to the hole, to the warmth, to whatever lived beneath the dirt and iron. He whispered again, almost tender, "I have more." And as sleep came, heavy, deep, and unshaken by the cold, the earth beneath his bed pulsed gently, like a heart or a furnace, or something older than both. In the spring, when the thaw came and the river split its banks, the game warden rode up the pass. He expected to find Ben Coleridge frozen in his cot, same as a dozen other trappers that winter. The storm had been brutal, record-breaking. Whole valleys vanished in snow. But when he reached the cabin, something stopped him. The door was intact. Smoke rose from the chimney, not thick but steady, and inside, it was warm. Ben was gone. Not a body, not a trace. The cot sat empty, the log pile untouched, and in the center of the room, beneath a wool blanket that had been pulled back, the hole waited, dark, breathing, warm.